Hello and welcome to this Microsoft Access course. We've taken the videos for this from our paid course, and we've even included follow-along exercises so you can put into practice what you learn. Now, in order to download the exercise files, just click on the link in the description box below. In this first video, we start with the basics of how to create your first table and fields before moving on to importing data, the Datasheet view, and creating links between tables. We hope you get a lot from this first video, and don't forget to watch parts 2 and 3 as well. The links to all the videos in this course are available in the description below. Now, your expert tutor, Toby, uses Access 2016 in these videos, but what we teach is relevant for anyone using Access 2013 or even the more recent versions of Microsoft Access.
Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's time now to do some real work on creating a working database, and the main example that I'm going to use during the course is the tour database. We created an empty starting point for that database a little while ago, and what we're going to do in this section is to start to add some content. Now, before we actually begin, the first thing I want to do is to change what's shown in the title bar there. By default, I get the file name, including the location on my device, the format, etc. Let's go into Access Options and give that a title. Now, really, the core of any Access database, in fact any database, is the data, and the data in modern databases are held in tables, and for the tour database we are going to have a number of tables. Now, the first table we're going to create is the table that really contains the details of what we call our core trips, and a trip is one particular entity, something that one of our travelers can do. And during the course of a year we may run a trip several times, and each instance of a trip we're going to call a tour. So say in a trip that we run all year round, say it's a 2 or 3 week trip, we might run it 15 or 20 times throughout the year. So that one trip will have many tours. So the first thing that I've done is to put together an example of the kind of information that I'm going to keep about a trip. Each trip will have a code, and the code for this trip is GCA, and GCA, those letters are arrived as sort of abbreviation of the name of the trip. The name of the trip is the Grand Canyon Family Rafting Adventure. The type of trip, well, it's actually got several types. It's a family trip, it's escorted, it's a group trip, involves activity, and there are landscapes to admire on this trip. The activity level is moderate. The country visited is the USA. And then there is a description of the trip, just a sentence or two normally. Now, of course, later on we may add much more detail about the trip, such as a full itinerary, but for the moment we're just setting up a description. The duration of the trip is stored in days, so 8 days normally means 7 nights. And the price range, excluding flights, is in the range $3,080 to $3,112. Individual tours, so instances of this trip, the prices will vary depending on, for example, the time of year, whether it's in school holiday, school vacation time, for example. And also, to some extent, will tend to vary the prices to reflect demand, so we maybe drop the price when the trip is not quite so popular. Now, all of that information ultimately will be stored for a trip, but there's one particular part of it, the type, that I am not going to store in the trip table at the moment. Now, the reason for that will become apparent to you later on in the course. I'm going to come to that in a few sections from now. You may be tempted, once you've looked at how I store the other information about the trip, to store the type in a similar way to the way that we're going to store activity level. But in fact, from a database design point of view, the facility to do that in Access is not a very good one, And also, if you do use the facility in Access to store those multiple type values, it will cause you a certain number of problems later on. So I'm going to skip type at the moment, but we're going to set up everything else in our first table. Now, there are a couple of other things I'd like to point out before we get started. One of them is that one or two of the things that I'm going to do here I will correct or change or replace later on. It's almost making deliberate errors, really, not quite, but almost, because some ways of doing some of these things really come later on when you become more familiar with other aspects of Access. And I want to do things in a pretty straightforward way to begin with. Now, let me give you an example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. If you look at that trip definition, country USA, you might say to yourself, well, hang on a minute, surely some of the trips are going to go to more than one country. Shouldn't I have a list of countries that are visited on the trip there? Well, the answer to that is, of course, yes, you should, but I'm going to deal with that later on. And in fact, that reflects the fact that even the most experienced database designer and developer will need to change their design, improve and extend their design later on in the life of a database. So it's just not possible to get everything right at the outset because the requirements change, for one thing, never mind any increase either in your own knowledge or in the facilities of the database system that you're using. It may be that the next version of Access brings in a facility that will give us a better way of doing something that we're doing here, but of course we don't know that yet. Having said all of that, it's a very good idea to get things as right as you can early on, because changing things in database design is itself a bit of a fraught process. Some things are easy to change, some of them involve quite a lot of what I would call jiggery-pokery in order to make them work. So some things you need to change can be a real pain. So let's get started creating this first table, the table that's going to hold the trip information. Now, in order to create a table, I go to the Create tab on the ribbon and click on Table. And that creates the first table. Now, that table has a default name of Table 1 and it's opened in what is called Datasheet View. You can tell that it's Datasheet View initially by looking down at the left-hand end of the status bar. You may recall when we looked at the status bar, we looked at the status bar when we had a form open. And the options at the right-hand end of the status bar enabled us to switch between the three available views for a form. Now, with a table, we have two available views. We have Datasheet View, which is the one that you can see at the moment. And then if I use the button at the extreme right-hand end, we have Design View. Now, one of the things that's going to happen a lot when you're working on a table is that whenever you do something to a table in terms of design, and in this case creating the table in the first place is treated as a design operation, you will be asked whether you want to save changes. And in fact, when you first create a table with, in this case, a default name of Table 1, the first thing that Access 2016 asks us to do, as soon as we even try to go into Design View, is to give the table a name. Now, this is the trip table, so I might be tempted to give it the name Trip. But I'm going to follow a convention that a lot of database designers and developers follow, whereby the objects in a database have a prefix which basically tells us what type of object it is. Now, in the case of tables, the prefix that we use is TBL. So I'm going to call this TBL trip, and that will remind me when this table name crops up in all sorts of situations later on that it's the trip table. Now, this might seem like a strange thing to do to you at the moment. I can assure you that it isn't. But I might later on have a form where I maintain trip information. I might call it the trip form. But that would have a prefix of FRM, so I'd call that FRM trip. And when I wanted to refer to something called trip, that would make it clear whether I meant the table, because I'd write table trip, or the form, because I'd write form trip. So the trip table is called table trip. Now I'm in design view for the trip table. And in design view I can see the individual fields that make up the table. And by default I have a single field. Its name, field name, which you see in the first column there, is ID. It has a data type of auto number, and I can put a description in as well. Now the description I'm going to put in here is unique trip ID. This is not the same as the trip code. This is a unique identifier which in many of the entities that we're going to design tables for is a very important part of the design of the table, because the contents of this field will be a number, and this number will be absolutely unique within the table. So once we've given a trip a numeric ID, it will absolutely uniquely identify that trip. Now the importance of that unique ID is best explained with an example. Let's suppose that I set up a trip, let's say this GCA, the Grand Canyon Adventure Trip, GCA. We set it up, we run it for a few years, and then we drop it again. Now if at a later stage we create a different trip called GCA, we would want to be able to differentiate between the old GCA and the new GCA. And we would do that using the unique ID. One very important aspect of unique IDs is that very often they are not visible to users of the system. They're used, if you like, for internal housekeeping. They're not a code that users of this trip database will refer to. Users will refer to it by the trip code, for example GCA, probably be completely unaware that there is a unique numeric code as well. Now before we start to add the fields to the trip table, I'm going to call it the trip table even though its real name is table trip. Let's close that property sheet on the right. That property sheet on the right relates to the whole table. I'm not going to worry about table properties overall at the moment. And now let's add a second field. Now the second field will be the first one that was in that little list that I showed you just now. So that's going to be the trip code. I'm just going to call it code. Now when I enter a field name for that code, click in data type, there is a default data type of short text. And in fact there are many data types in Access, and we're going to be working our way through these over the coming sections. Short text is one that we'll use quite a bit. Now as a description of that, I'm just going to put in here at the moment 3-character trip code. And with this particular field selected, so I've got the second row in design view of this table. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see the properties of that field. There is a field properties grid. And the very first item in that grid, field size, gives us the maximum number of characters that can be held in that field. By default it's 255. I'm going to change it to 3. Now there are many properties, and some of these, such as format and input mask and caption, I'm going to come back to later on. I'll also come back to default value, validation rule, validation text, but I am going to look at required. In order to store a trip in this table, must it have a trip code? Yes, it must. So required, which defaults to no, needs to say yes. Now I can either delete the word no and type the word yes, or I can use the drop down arrow at the right hand end there and change no to yes. Could the trip code be 0 length? No, it couldn't. It has to actually have 3 characters. So the answer to that is no. And finally, will it be indexed? Now I'm going to explain keys and indexes at the start of the next section, For the moment the answer is yes, but the trip code cannot be duplicated. So I'm going to click on that one, click on the drop down and change it to yes, no duplicates. And what I now have is the definition of the second field in my trip table. It's code, it's a 3-character short text field, it's required and it is indexed, but you can't have duplicate values in there. So that's it for this section. In the next section we're going to carry on and set up a few more fields for the trip table. Please join me for that. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we got to work on creating the trip table for the Esprit de Tour travel company. And we've only got a couple of fields so far. We're going to add a few more fields in this section, but I've got a few other things to point out about this table to you first. And the first of them relates to indexes and keys. As the content of a database grows, and as the volume of data in the database grows, as people are using the database, it can potentially take longer and longer to find what you need in the database. Now, one of the ways that you can improve the performance, say searching a database, is by indexing some of the fields. Now, the last field that we added to this table was a code field. This is the 3-character code identifying a trip. And if somebody wants to find out information about that trip and the code is not indexed, what Access has to do is to read through all of the trips in the database, all of the trips in the trip table, to find the one with that code. So it looks at each trip and says, has this one got that code? No. Has this one got that code? And so on. However, if you index the code, then what Access does is to maintain an index. It's a little bit like, say, a telephone directory. And when you say to Access, I want information about the trip with this code, it goes straight to the trip with that code. So it makes it much quicker for Access to find the information that you want. However, there is a cost to this, and the cost is that in order to maintain these indexes, as a user maintains, modifies data in, for example, the trip table, the process of keeping all of these indexes up to date tends to slow down the maintenance process, not the searching process, but the process of maintaining the data. Now, if you look at the bottom right hand corner of the screen at the moment, you can see a regular little statement there about indexes. An index speeds up searches and sorting on a field, but may slow updates. Selecting yes, no duplicates prohibits duplicate values in the field. Now, in order to make a decision about whether a field needs to be indexed or not, there are certain technical considerations, but there are also very important business considerations. And if you take something like code here, the 3-character code for a trip is a very important identifier for a trip, and therefore this is the sort of field that you would index on. But more about indexing as we go along. Now, the other important thing here that I didn't point out is that if I go back to that first field, the ID field, you'll see a little key symbol to the left of the word ID. And when I clicked there, you may have noticed that on the ribbon, on the Design tab, the primary key control became highlighted. And that's because the ID is the primary key for this particular table. That means that whatever the ID of a trip is the main way that we identify it, the main unique way that we identify a record in this table. Now, this goes back to the unique identification property that I talked about in the preceding section. Every table will normally have a primary key. Often we will use IDs, such as the auto number ID for the trip table. Sometimes we will use something else, as you will see. Let me also talk a little bit more now about these views. We're currently in Design View, and in Design View, note that we have a contextual tab, a Design tab, and it's part of the Table Tools contextual tabs. Now, some of the controls on the Design tab we'll be looking at later on. Note that one of them is Property Sheet that we closed earlier on. We still don't need the Property Sheet, but that's how you can open it again. Note also to the left of Property Sheet that there are options there to insert rows. This is insert rows in the design of this table. And also to delete rows, which basically means to delete fields from the table. I showed you earlier how to switch to Datasheet view. Apart from using the buttons at the right hand end of the status bar, you do have a view button on the left. And if I click on Datasheet view, as expected, I'm asked you must first save the table. I have made changes to this table design since I last saved it, so I'm going to say yes to saving the table. And I'm now in Datasheet view. In Datasheet view, I get the Table Tools contextual tabs. There is a Fields tab and a Table tab. And really the main reason that I get different tabs for those different ways of working on a table is that in essence Datasheet view is a view in which we enter and modify data in a table, and Design view is how we work on the design of the table. Now, strictly speaking, it's not a very clear distinction, because in Datasheet view you can do some simple design. So for instance, given that I've currently got two fields in the trip table, that's the ID field and the code field, in Datasheet view the fields correspond to the columns and the rows will be the individual records in the trip table. If I want to add a third field here, and the third field I'm going to add is the name of the trip, all I need to do is click in here. If I right click, it lets me choose a data type. I'm going to say short text, and then I'm going to rename that to trip name. I can't actually only call it name because name is what's called a reserved word in Access. Name has another meaning. So if I call it trip name, I've now defined another field. Now I'm quite limited in what I can do in that definition, so to go into more detail about trip name I really need to go back into Design view. But it can be a simple way of, if you like, roughly setting up the fields at the start of designing a table. Let's switch back into Design view now. There's my new field. Trip name is a short text field. Let's click on that row in Design view. It currently allows 255 characters. Well, that should be plenty for a name for a trip. Do we require a name? Yes, we do. Do we allow a zero length name? No, we don't. Is name indexed? No. Text fields, fields with a lot of text in them, are not often indexed. Normally, if you wanted to find a trip with a particular name, you would expect Access to have to actually go through the trips and find that one. Whereas if you had the 3-character code, you'd expect it to go straight to it. You may also, for example, want to search for part of the name of a trip. But again, more on that later. So they're the basic settings for trip name. What I'm going to do now is put in a description. And that's my third field set up. Now let me switch back into Datasheet view. As usual, save the changes. And now we have 3 fields in the trip table. So I'm sure you can see by now the pattern of setting up the fields in this table. We've still got a few more to do. But one thing we haven't done yet is to add any data to the table. And I'm going to add a sort of dummy trip to the table now to demonstrate a couple of other things that you need to be aware of. In terms of loading a reasonable amount of data into the table, I'm going to cover that in 2 or 3 sections from now. And also, noting that we are in Datasheet view, I'm going to spend some time talking about Datasheet view in more detail, also in 2 or 3 sections from now. But for the moment, let me give you a very brief explanation of what you can see in Datasheet view. Each row is a record in the table, so in our case that would be a trip. And all the time we haven't got any trip information there at all. We have one row with a star at the left hand end, and note in ID the word new in brackets. That indicates that if I start typing in this particular row, I'll be creating a new trip. Let's make up a trip. Let's put in a code. Let's call the code for this trip LEX. So that's my 3-character code. Now let me type in my trip name. It's going to be Louisiana Explorer. Now as I start typing into this field, if I find that there isn't enough room to see what I'm typing, I can make the column wider by just hovering over the header in the normal way, move out to the right until I get the double-headed arrow, and I can drag that right-hand column edge over to the right to give myself a bit more space to type in. And I have my first record in the database. Now note the ID is 3. That is a number that is automatically assigned by Access. It's an auto number field, so I don't have to do anything about that. If I deleted that record and started another new one, it would be ID 4. So the numbers don't get reused. And you'll notice that to the left hand end of that row with Louisiana Explorer in it, there's a little pen icon. That indicates that this is the record that I'm currently working on. And if I click away, say I click down onto the new row again, which is ready for the next row in my table, the pen disappears and I have one record stored in my table. Now of course that one record doesn't have all of the fields of information that ultimately trips need, but it's a start. So not only have we now got 3 fields defined in our table, but we've added the first row of data. In the next section we're going to add some more fields, and they're going to be fields of different types again, so please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to continue setting up the trip table, and we're going to turn our attention now to the next field, which is activity level. Now the key difference between activity level and the fields we've dealt with so far is that activity level is going to offer the operator, the person setting up the trips, a number of options, and the operator will choose from the options. Now the actual number could be quite a small number, as in this case we're just going to set up 3 options, or you could have 20 or 50 or 100, as many as you like really. But how those options are kept is another matter. Now in this particular example we're going to keep them in what I think is probably the easiest way that there is, but later on in the course we're going to have to extend this into some sort of more complex and flexible arrangements. So all I do here is when I click in data type, the option I'm going to select is Lookup Wizard, because the options that are available here will be looked up from a list, and we're going to set this list up using the Lookup Wizard. Now the Lookup Wizard is a sequence of screens, and on the first page it says the wizard creates a lookup field which displays a list of values you can choose from. How do you want your lookup field to get its values? Well, the first option is to get the values from another table or from a database query. Now that's the method we're going to use later. For this first example we're just going to type in the values that are available, so we're going to choose the second option. Click Next. Now when it comes to setting the options up, the user may be selecting from just a list of single items, or the list itself they choose from could be more complex, and it could have more than one column of information in the list. Now we're going to stick with a 1-column example here, and the options we're offering for activity level are leisurely or leisurely, moderate, and challenging. And each of our trips will be classified according to one of those three options. So having entered the three options, we click on Next. What label would you like for your lookup field? Well, I'm going to stick with activity level. I should point out that generally speaking, when I'm naming fields, I name them without spaces, and I try to use pretty straightforward, simple names which reflect what information is in each field. Various people use various other approaches to naming fields. Some people will put spaces in them. There's no reason that you shouldn't technically, but they do cause a little bit more work later on, particularly if you get into programming within Access 2016. And once you have spaces in field names, there are certain conventions you have to follow when referring to fields. And I don't find a particular need to put spaces in. I tend to use a version of what's called camel case, or there's various other names by which it's known, whereby I keep the capitalization on the words, so activity level has a capital A and a capital on the first L, to make it easier to see what the words in the name are. Similarly for trip name there. Some people put underscores between the words. That's fine, that avoids the space issue. And some people even put prefixes on field names in order to reflect what sort of data it is. So an integer field, they'd put an int at the start of. Text field, they may put something like txt at the start of. But as I say, when I'm naming fields in Access 2016, I tend to use pretty straightforward names. Now back to the Lookup Wizard. Limit to list is next. Do I want to limit the user's choices to that list of levels? The answer in this case is yes, I do. I don't want somebody who is setting up or changing information about trips to introduce a new level. So they have to choose one of the three available levels. Of course, at some later stage, I may well change the list, I may introduce other levels, but I want that done in a controlled kind of way. The next option there is allow multiple values. Now this is really quite a controversial feature in Access. It was introduced relatively recently, and what this means is that if you have a list such as this one, you can select more than one of the available values. Now in the case of these activity levels, choosing two different ones like leisurely and challenging, for example, would seem a bit bizarre. But if you take a different example, supposing I was setting up a list for choosing country from, it might be perfectly valid to choose two or more countries from the list because the trip might go through two or more countries. Now you can do that in Access. You could set up a list exactly like that for countries. You could allow multiple values, but we're not going to do that because from a database design point of view, using this feature in Access is not good, and most of the database designers and developers I know do not use this feature for reasons that will become apparent later on. You can use it, it does work, but it doesn't really follow good database design principles. Now in this case we're not allowing multiple values, so we can just leave that particular checkbox unchecked and click on Finish. So let me add a description for this field, and then let me set the field properties. Field size, well, it certainly doesn't have to be 255 characters because it's only holding one word, but let's say be a little bit conservative and say 30 characters. This is the maximum size, by the way. In older database design and development tools, when you gave a field size, every time you recorded something it took that amount of space, so you could be very wasteful by declaring these sizes to be too big. Nowadays that is really only setting a maximum, and therefore you can be a little bit over generous. And in this case, for example, you may come up with an activity level later on where the length of the word or words is longer than any of the three that we have already. Now I'm again going to skip the next half dozen field. Is activity level required? Well, yes it is. We always tell our potential travellers how active a trip is. Do we allow a zero length activity level? No, we don't. And is it indexed? Well, yes it is, because we'll quite often want to search, say, on leisurely trips, and we want to be able to identify those without looking at every trip in the list. So in this case it's yes, and in fact it's yes with duplicates OK, because there will be many trips that have the same value in activity level. For instance, many trips where the activity level is moderate. So we've set those general properties, but this particular short text field uses a lookup, and therefore we can click on the lookup tab there within the field properties, and you can see additional properties related to the lookup. The first of those is the display control that will be used by default for this field on a form, and the control that's going to be used is a combo box. If you're not familiar with these display controls, you don't know what a combo box is, I'm going to show you one of those a little bit later on in the course and explain how they work in relation to a lookup. The second property, the row source type, relates to the choice that we made very early on using the Lookup Wizard, where it said, do you want to get the values for the list from a table or a query, or would you like to type them in? Well, we chose to type them in, which is the value list option there. If instead of that we'd gone for example, a table or query, then table or query would have been shown here, but value list is the option we're using. And there is our list of 3 values. They're in double quotes, separated by semicolons. If I want to add a value here, or even delete one of these, I can do it just by typing in here. So let me put a new value in. I've decided that some of our trips are not quite leisurely and not quite moderate, so I've introduced a new value there, leisurely to moderate. That's not longer than 30 characters, so that's fine. And then moving down, the other choices were made. Limit to list. Is the user limited to choosing from the list? Yes. Do we allow multiple values? No. There's one other setting here which defaults to yes. Allow value list edits. So that allow users to edit the values that are in the list. I'm going to change that to no, because I'm certainly not going to allow that. And that's it. That's the settings for the activity level field. What I now need to do is to set an appropriate value for our Louisiana Explorer trip. Now, as soon as I try to switch back into Datasheet view, Access 2016 realizes that I have made a change to the design of this table. So, do you want to save the table now? Yes. Now it's going to check the data integrity rules. You don't have to have the data integrity rules checked. Normally you will want to, but one particular situation where this can prove annoying is if you've just added a field and you know that even though it's a required field, existing records won't have values in there yet. You still have to go in and give those existing records values in that new or changed field. So what happens if I say yes at this point is that I get a message saying existing data violates the new setting for the required property for field activity level. Now you can either say, yep, I know about that, but keep the setting that I've just made and continue testing, in which case you click on yes. If you want to revert to the old setting but continue testing, you click on no. And to stop testing, just to go into Datasheet view, all you need to do is press the cancel key. So that's what I'm going to do on this occasion. Now I can go into that new field, activity level. When I click in there, I get a drop down and I can choose one of my allowed values. I'm going to choose the second value, leisurely to moderate. And I'm also going to just widen that field enough that you can see the field that's in there. The next field that I'm going to add is the country field. Now, as I discussed earlier on, ultimately we need to be able to specify that a trip visits a number of countries, but at this stage all I'm going to do is to record the main country that a trip visits. And I'm going to use a lookup again, so I'm going to put in a value list. On this occasion though, I'm going to say that the selection is not limited to the list. I'm not quite sure which countries are initially going to be available in our trips. That will obviously develop in the early stages of designing, building and using the database. So I expect the list to be quite dynamic in the early stages as we add more and more countries to it. So as people are setting up our trips, I want them to be able to add countries that aren't in the list. So in the case of the country field, the user will not be limited to list. So I'm going to do that now. Join me again when I've completed it. So there we are, country is set up. Let me go into Datasheet view and record the country for the Louisiana Explorer. Okay, that's done. And we've just got one more field to do in this section. This next field is description, and it certainly won't be a short text field. Although sometimes it may be shorter than 255 characters, often it will be quite a bit longer, although probably only a few sentences. The data type we're going to use for this is long text. And in fact, a long text field can hold something up to about a gigabyte of text. That's quite a long description. However, using access forms and so on, you're restricted to displaying and using round about 64,000 characters. So we wouldn't be able to let a description get quite as huge as the maximum size that this data type can support. I'm going to use long text. I'm going to set the properties. And the main one to point out is that you wouldn't normally have a long text field indexed. So indexed in this case will be no. So I'll do that. Join me again in a moment. Then we'll switch into Datasheet view and add a description for the Louisiana Explorer. So that's the description of our sort of dummy tour. We've got just a few more fields to add now, and all of these other fields are numeric. We're going to cover those in the next section. Please join me for that. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. We've been setting up the fields in the trip table in the Esprit de Tour database, and in this final section on setting up the fields, we're going to add the remaining ones, which are all numeric. The first of these is going to be the duration of the trip in days. So first of all, I'm going to call this field duration days. The default data type, as always, is short text, but on this occasion this is going to be numeric, so I'm going to change that to number. We now have a bit of a quandary, because depending on how much you know about the way that numbers are stored in computers in general, in Microsoft Office, or even in Access, you may or may not be able to choose a number field size. Now if I click down at the first property in field properties, there's a little drop down there. It says byte or integer or long integer or single. You may have no idea what each of those are, and you may have no idea which of those will be most suitable for storing the duration of a trip in days. Now the information you need is embedded in the Access help, but there isn't one simple place to find it which fully explains, I think, everything that you need to know. So I'm going to take you to two places in Access help that will be of assistance to you in this. So first of all, let's open up Access help and let's go to Design Tables. And one of the options there is Data Types. And this explains in pretty good terms all of the data types in Access. So for instance, short text holds alphanumeric data, names, titles, etc. up to 255 characters. We've used that one quite a bit already. Long text, large amounts of alphanumeric data, sentences and paragraphs. And as I said in the previous section, up to about a gigabyte of data, but controls to display a long text are limited to the first 64,000 characters. So all of the data types that are supported are in this list. It's very helpful, but when you get to numeric data, it rather unhelpfully says numeric data 1, 2, 4, 8 or 16 bytes. Now even if you know how many bytes you need to store the duration of a trip in days, whether you can translate that to the names in that drop down list I just showed you is another question. So in order to work out the name of the numeric type that you need to go to another place in the Access help. And in order to find it, the way I always remember it, is that I search on conversion. And the first item that you find there is type conversion functions. Now believe me, you don't need to know anything about type conversion functions, but if you go down into that topic, it explains those different numbers and what range each of them can store. So it tells you that a byte can store from 0 to 255. If we used byte to store the duration in days of a trip, our longest trip could be 255 days. Now that's not bad actually, that's what, about 8 or 9 months, something like that. However, we may ultimately have longer trips than that, so maybe we should go for the next size up, if you like. And the next size up is integer. An integer can store numbers in the range minus 32,768 to plus 32,767. Now a 32,767 day trip is a long trip. You're getting on towards 100 years. I doubt whether many people will be going on trips that long. So integer looks like the type to go for. While we're here, you might want to take a look at what long is. Now that's a big number. Or what double is. Now that's a really, really big number. But we're going to go for integer. So let's close the help. Let's go back to our properties and let's select as our type here integer. Now so far I've been ignoring some of the properties for these fields, and the time has come to stop ignoring a couple of them. You saw just now that we can store a number from minus 32,768 to plus 32,767 in this type of field. I want to make sure that when people are storing the duration of a trip, they always store a positive duration. Now a day trip would just have a duration of 1 day, so it only needs to be 1 or more, but you can't have a trip duration of 0, and you certainly can't have a trip duration that's negative. So I'm going to introduce here a validation rule and some validation text. My validation rule is going to be greater than 0, and my validation text is going to be duration must be greater than 0. Is the duration required? Yes. Is it indexed? Yes. We'll very often be looking at trips or choosing trips by duration, so we need to index that, and of course duplicates are okay in duration. We'll have many trips with the same duration. So let's now go back up and enter a description for the field, and let's try it out on the Louisiana Explorer. So in order to test out my validation, I'm going to put in a duration of say minus 3 days. Let me just click away from that record. There we are, duration must be greater than 0. Okay, let's click back in there and change that from minus 3 to plus 8. Okay, that's fine. So our validation is working fine. I'd probably want to check it with 0 as well, but I can assure you that's fine. We're going to turn our attention finally in the trip table to the price range. And notice that these are the prices excluding flights. Now, although price range is something that you very often see expressed if you were, say, looking for a holiday, a vacation, in terms of the functionality of the database and enabling users to search a price range, it's better to store the price range as 2 separate values, a minimum price and a maximum price. And it's also important to note that this is the price range in general terms for the trip. When somebody comes to book onto a specific tour, so that's an instance of the trip, starting on a particular day for example, there will be a specific set of prices for that tour. Normally an adult price, possibly a child price when children are allowed, maybe special offers like family prices and so on. So the price range here really is just a range of prices, and the tours will have their own specific values. So we're going to store a minimum price and a maximum price. So we'll start with price minimum, data type. Now on this occasion it will be currency, and by default Access 2016 will use my local currency, which is currently set to US dollar. Increasingly, travel companies in particular are dealing to a worldwide market, and people accessing the Esprit de Tour database as potential customers may or may not see these prices advertised in US dollars. We may well build into the database in the later stages of development facilities to deal with currency exchange, currency conversions, so that although we will store our price ranges and our individual prices in US dollars, a customer in another country such as the UK might see these prices in pounds sterling, and maybe in other countries, in India for instance, may see the prices in rupees and so on. So what we're building here is, if you like, a basic core set of prices in US dollars, but we may well use other currencies when we're dealing with customers in other countries. So let's put in a description here, and let's put in a validation rule and some validation text. Is a minimum price required? Yes. Is it indexed? Yes, there will be lots of searching on prices, I'm sure. Now let me do the same for price maximum. Okay, let's go in and put in a price range for the Louisiana Explorer trip. And there you are. I've also checked that my validation rules are working okay, and they are. Note that when I define this field as being of type currency, I automatically get correct currency punctuation. I didn't have to type the dollar sign there, or the commas, or the .00 for the cents. That's all done for me automatically by Access. So at this stage in development, I've now finished the definition of the trip table. I'm going to need to load some data. I'll be coming to that a little bit later on. But that's it on the trip table. It's time now for you to do exercise 1, and that's covered in the next section. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's now time for you to do exercise 1. And exercise 1 is the very first step towards creating a movie rental database. Now this is not only going to be a database with movie information in it. We're going to start off with some movie information, and then we're going to add information related to people doing online rentals of physical DVDs. So we're not talking about downloading movies, we're talking about getting movies on physical media. Now clearly, as with the Esprit de Tour database, this is not going to be an all-singing, all-dancing, fully functional database by the end of the course. We're talking about putting a pretty straightforward model in place, but what you'll learn in doing this would certainly give you the ability to get a long way down the road of producing a fully functional database. Now one of the reasons that I've chosen a movie database as the basis of the exercises on this course is that movies are something that people are generally aware of, and people are generally aware of the sort of information there is available about movies. If you really don't want to work on a movie database while you're doing this course, by all means choose a subject of your own, maybe something related to your work or something that you're interested in your private life. And when you're doing this, the main thing I want you to concentrate on is, even if you're not doing the movie related examples, in setting up your own database, you're incorporating the sort of features that I'm covering in the exercises. Now with each of the exercises, apart from giving you the instructions on what to do and hopefully giving you enough information about what you have to do, I'll also be providing a sample answer. So for instance, in exercise 1, I will be providing my own solution, if you like, to exercise 1. So if for any reason you can't do a particular exercise, you don't have the time, or you run into some sort of technical problem, or I've not made it clear enough what you need to do, to get you started on the next part of the exercise, you can always use my sample answer. So if you don't manage to get exercise 1 done, use my exercise 1 to get you started on exercise 2. So what do you need to do for exercise 1? Well, first of all, you need to create a movie rental database. The name of the rental company is going to be Night Movies. Now, I intend this to be spelled N-I-G-H-T, night as in not day. If you really want to call it something like N-I-T-E, Night Movies, that's up to you. Or even K-N-I-G-H-T, make it night that way, that's up to you. But the company is called Night Movies, and the first version of the database I would like you to call nightmovies01.acdb. And the movie table needs the first 4 of the fields there: the title, the director, the year of release, and the runtime in minutes. Now later on we're going to be adding information about movie genre and about the actors and the roles that they play, but I don't want you to try to set those up yet. They are for later on. I also don't really want you to start adding loads of movie information to your table, because I'm going to provide you with some movie information, and in a section or 2 from now I'm going to show you how to import that into your database. But more on that later. I would, however, point out that when you set up your movie table, which will hold basic data about a movie, you probably want a unique identifier, because of course many movies have been made with the same title as previous movies. So that's it. My sample solution is in the exercise folder. Good luck with that. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section I'm going to introduce you to 1 or 2 basic ways of importing data into an Access database. Now before we start, I should point out that so far, and in fact for most of this course, when we talk about an Access database, we really mean a single file, an ACDB file, and within that ACDB file there are many things. Amongst the things within an ACDB file there will be a number of tables. Now we've already created 1 or 2 tables, and of course in a database that supports particularly some kind of business activity there will probably be many tables. Now it's not the case that the tables holding the data will always be in the database, in our case the ACDB file that you're working on. Sometimes the tables may be external to your database. Let me give you an example. I mentioned just a little earlier on that when it comes to dealing with people booking vacations with Esprit de Tour and paying for vacations, they probably book and pay for them using their local currency. So there will be a table somewhere where we look up a currency conversion rate. Now that is not a table that we would necessarily maintain in our own database. We may use a table in another database somewhere else, or we may use a service linked to a currency exchange database. And it will quite often be the case that a database application will get its data from a number of tables in a number of different places. Now when we get data in that way, when we basically access data from somewhere else, we use the general term linking. And one of the things that you can do in Access is to link to tables in other databases. Now I'm not going to cover linking in this course. If you go to the External Data tab, you'll see that there are 2 groups on that tab. There is an import and link group, and there's an export group. Now export we're going to look at later. Import and link, well I've just said we're not going to cover link. What we're going to look at in this section is import. Now what happens when we import data is that we will get data from somewhere else, but we will import it into one or more tables in our own Access database. Now, there are various places that you can import data from. For instance, you can import data from an Excel workbook. You can import data from another Access database. You can import data from a selection of ODBC, that's Open Database Connectivity databases. That means other types of database, not necessarily Access databases, but which conform to a standard that is called ODBC. And in fact, there are many other places. You can get data from XML files, you can get data from SharePoint, from data services. This would include something like a currency exchange service. So there are many other places you can get data from to import into Access. But what I'm going to cover on this section by way of an introduction to importing data is importing data from a text file. And this is a very common way of importing data into a database. Having said that, for those of you who are familiar with Microsoft Excel, and for those of you who have a copy of Microsoft Excel, I'm also going to partly demonstrate importing from Excel. So if you have and use Excel, then you might like to try this particular option, because text files and Excel are two of the most common ways of getting data into an Access database. So let's start with importing some trips into the Esprit de Tour database. What I've got here is an Excel workbook. If you don't use Excel or you don't understand Excel workbooks, there's absolutely no need to worry, because this is really only for the people that use Excel. You'll still be able to follow what I do as I import data into the Esprit de Tour database, and you'll still be able to do the exercise in the next section. Now, I've got about a dozen trips here, and they're the first ones that the company is going to offer. And each column in the workbook corresponds to a field in the trip table that we created. And the column headings tell you which field they correspond to. So we've got code, trip name, activity level, country. You've seen all those before, of course. Now, for each of the trips, there is one row in the Excel workbook. So the first trip, GCA, Grand Canyon Family Rafting Adventure, activity level moderate, country USA. There's then a description, the duration in days, a minimum price in US dollars, maximum price in US dollars. And there are about a dozen of these. Now, what I'm going to do is to show you how you would start importing this data in Excel. If you don't use Excel, as I say, don't worry. We'll be moving on to the way that we're actually going to do it very shortly. So let me close the workbook. Now, I'm in the Esprit de Tour database. I'm going to go to the External Data tab, and I'm going to click on Excel. Get external data from an Excel spreadsheet. Now, the first thing we do is to locate the spreadsheet. Well, this particular spreadsheet I've put in the Course Files folder. So if you do want to try this yourself as an Excel import, you'll find it in that folder. And that's what it's called, Esprit de Tour trip import.xlsx. So I open that, which is fine. And then I have three options. First of all, I could import the source data into a new table in the current database. So I could import that data and put it in a brand new table. I'm not going to do that on this occasion. I could append a copy of the records to the existing table, and then I choose my table. Now, of course, in the Esprit de Tour database, we only have one table at the moment. It's the trip table. And in fact, appending those records to that table is exactly what I'm going to do. The third option is to link to the data source by creating a linked table. What I could do is not to import the data into Access at all, to leave it in that Excel workbook and to link to it in the Excel workbook. And the way that I do that is I choose that third option, And what Access basically does is to set up, it's a sort of dummy table in a way. It's almost like a window into that workbook so that you can access the data as though the data were in a table in this Access database, but the data is actually held in an Excel workbook. Now once you'd made the choices we've got there, so you've chosen the Excel workbook, you've clicked on append a copy of the records to the table and the table, you then click on OK, and you go through a sequence of steps to make sure that you're getting the right information. Let's just start this off without actually doing it. So I click on OK, and as you can see, it's already worked out how to slice the data up. Let's just scroll along there. Let's go to the end and make sure it's got prices and durations. Okay, it looks fine actually. So we then click on next, and away we go doing the import. Now on this occasion I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to cancel, but by all means try it yourself. And we're going to do the import from a text file. The text file in question is also in the course files folder. It's called Esprit de Tour trip import.txt, and I have it open here in Notepad. Apart from giving those of you who use Excel the opportunity to import this data from Excel, looking at the data in Excel, it's a lot easier to see the structure of the data than it is in this text file. The text file is in a format that's called tab delimited, and it's got a number of rows. The first row contains the field names. These are the field names that match the field names in our trip table. And then each subsequent row in this file is one of the trips. Now each of the fields in a trip is separated from the next by a tab character, and that's why it's called tab delimited. And when Access reads a file like this, it recognizes where each field starts by the tab characters. Now you don't have to use a tab character as a separator, and various other separators are available. One of the most common separators to use is a comma, and we refer in that case to a comma separated file or a comma separated values file, a CSV file. Now I can't really use commas here because the data itself contains commas. Look at the third row there, ITI, the description of the trip. Immerse yourself in Italy's iconic cities of Venice, Florence, etc. If I tried to separate the fields here with commas, Access will get terribly confused because it would think that Venice was the end of one field and Florence was a different field altogether, and it would just get totally confused. So in this case, because none of the actual data contains tab characters, I'm using tab separators. So this is a tab delimited file. Now if you decided that you wanted to use a different separator, such as commas, and there are many other separators that you can use, you can to some extent overcome the problems that I've just talked about by enclosing text in double quotes. So for instance, you could take the whole of that description, immerse yourself in Italy's iconic cities onwards, the whole of that field, and put it in double quotes, and Access would recognize that it was all one field. So that would be one way of getting around the problem I've just described. But on this occasion, using tab delimiters should be fine. So let's close that and let's import the contents of this file into the Esprit de Tour database. I should point out that in the course files folder I'm importing this into version 2 of the Esprit de Tour database. The start of this is just like the Excel version, so we go up to external data. On this occasion we choose text file, and that starts the Get External Data text file wizard. We browse to that text file in the course files folder. We're going to use the second option, append a copy of the records to the table trip. Click on OK. We now have a choice. We can either say it's a delimited file, which of course it is. You can actually present the data in the form of fixed width file. So we could have a fixed number of characters for the code, a fixed number for the trip name, and so on. But on this occasion we've chosen delimited, so we go with delimited. Click on next. One thing I need to make clear to Access is that the first row actually contains the field names. The first row is not one of the trips. So there's a checkbox here. First row contains field names. I check that. Now Access will know what the field names are, which data corresponds to which field name. And note that Access has already taken a look at this file and has suggested that tab is the delimiter, which of course is correct. Now at this point it's a good idea to scroll through and just check that it seems to have sorted everything out okay. Well, certainly all of those numbers at the end look right to me, and the descriptions look fine, so let's click on Next. There's a checkbox there. I would like a wizard to analyze my table after importing the data. If I was importing this into either a new table, which is one of the options at the beginning, or to a table where I hadn't really set it up properly yet, the wizard would actually look at the data after importing it and suggest settings for the fields. Now we've already spent quite a bit of time in defining the properties of the fields in this table, so we're not going to check that box. We're going to click on Finish. And Access 2016 thinks that it has successfully imported the data. If I was going to get a lot more data in this form that I might want to add to that table, I could check this box here and save the import steps. And one of the options at the left hand end of the External Data tab is to use a saved import. So to save me making all these same selections again, I could select a saved import and basically it will perform the same operation on a different text file for me subsequently. I'm not going to save these import steps. I'm just going to click on Close. And let's open up the trip table and see what we've got. Well, a first look at that suggests to me that that's pretty good actually. Now of course you can't see the whole of the descriptions because they're too long to show in the available space, but that doesn't mean to say that the data's not there. Let me just drag that over to the right. That's all there. We'll talk about other ways of looking at the data later on. But apart from the first record, which is of course our sort of dummy one that we tested things out on, everything else looks fine. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's now time to set you Exercise 2. And I'm going to start by looking at my answer to Exercise 1. In Exercise 1 you should have created the Night Movies database, and you should finish up with a single table, movie, table movie in my case, and 5 fields in it. There's an auto-numbered ID field and then 4 other fields, which I've called Title, Directors with an S at the end, Year of Release and Runtime Minutes. Now you are not going to need to use the same field names as me, but you will need to make sure that any data that I provide for you, such as in this exercise, is either modified to fit your own field names, or you'll need to modify your field names to fit mine. Now the subject of field names, in fact names in general, is one to warn you about right now, and that is that in Access there are a number of reserved words. I'm going to show you that list in just a moment, but you need to beware of those reserved words. They're words that Access uses for things, and if you use them for field names, for example, or various other names within Access 2016, they might appear to work, but they're quite likely to cause you a problem, so you should avoid these words. Let's take a look at them in the help. So I'm doing a search there on reserved words, and the topic there explains Access reserved words and symbols, and then gives a list. It's quite a long list. Some of the words are a bit obscure, you might well not use those anyway, but some of them are probably a little bit dangerous. So for instance, you have a reserved word from. You might be quite tempted to use the word from, say for a field name or group perhaps. Well, I would avoid all of these words. So that's reserved words. So given the names that I've used and the field properties for each of the fields and so on, and this is version 1, I've then created version 2 of the Night Movies database. My answer to this exercise is in version 2. Let's now look at the exercise itself. I provided you with two files, and you can use either one of the two files, and each of the files contains details of 50 well-known movies. Now, the details included are the ones that I've asked you to include in your movie table. So we have title, directors, year of release, runtime, minutes. And we're currently looking at the Excel file. So if you're an Excel user, you can use this one if you want to. Note those headings on those four columns. They agree exactly with the field names that I've used in my Night Movies database. And yours needs to agree as well. Now, strictly speaking, there is an advanced facility in the import that we've been through already. I didn't look at the advanced facility, but in the advanced facility you can map different names to different names. But I'm not going into that now. For the moment, you just need to make sure that the names at the top of these four columns in Excel match the names of your four fields. If they don't, then your choice is either change the names of the headings in Excel here, or change the name of the fields in your movie table in your Night Movies database. So that's the Excel option. The alternative I provided you with, and this is for the non-Excel users, is a tab delimited text file. It has exactly the same data in it, and again the very first row here contains my four field names. So if these four names don't agree with the names that you've used, you've got the same choice. You can either change the names in this text file, or you can change the field names in your movie table. But in either case, you need to do an import into your movie table. And here is my answer, version 2 of the movie database. Now, I should point out that before I did this, I didn't delete the test movie. So I've actually got the Shawshank Redemption twice, although note the different IDs for the two versions. And I'm going to get rid of that first one in a later section. But if you have a duplicate, or whether you've deleted the first one, don't really mind. You're going to delete that extra one later. But you should finish up ultimately with 50 movies. Now we're going to record quite a bit more information about these movies as we work through the course. But this is a good starting point. Good luck with exercise 2. I'll see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to look at a very important topic, and one which will slightly interrupt our flow in terms of further developing our databases. But once you start storing even a moderate amount of data in an Access database, you need to make sure that that data is safe. Now, various things can go wrong. For instance, let's suppose that you're working through this course on a laptop and you're setting up your movies and you're starting to add movie information. Maybe you've started creating a database covering something of your own interest as well. If somebody stole your laptop with all of your work on it, you'd be more than a little unhappy. Unfortunately, another possibility is that you're working away on your Access database or databases, and for some reason one of them gets broken. Something happens, it could be Access's fault, not yours, but the database stops working. Now, one very important thing to have up your sleeve in either of these situations is a backup copy of your database. Now, I should point out that what I'm talking about in this section relates to Access desktop databases and not Access apps or web apps, which we're going to look at a bit later on. And I should also point out that one of the big advantages of Access is that in the configuration that we have at the moment, everything is in one file, one ACDB file. So you don't actually have to do anything other than keep a safe copy of your ACDB file. Now, I should also point out that the use of a single ACDB file is only one way of creating and operating Access desktop databases. There are options such as splitting the database, which mean that you can separate out the data from what's called the UI, the user interface. But here I am talking in this section just about the situation where we have a single ActDB file. Now, in order to take a backup, it really is a straightforward case of copying that file on a regular basis. And when you do it will depend on how much you use the database. So if you tend to use a database every day, do quite a bit of work on it, you don't want to lose a load of data, maybe you're entering new records every day, you probably want to take a copy of the file every day. If you only use it occasionally, you may want to take a copy of it, say, just after you've done a batch of work on it on a more irregular basis. Other situations in which you might want to take a backup copy might be just before you make a major design change. So let's suppose you're working on the movie database, you've added a load of movies and you're just about to add the actors to the movies and maybe make some more changes to the movie table. Immediately before that would be a good idea to take a backup of your database so that if it all goes horribly wrong, you can get back to that backup copy. You'll also see later on in the course when we talk about queries that you might do what are called action queries, queries where you update some data using some sort of programming logic. Let's think in terms of esprit de tour. Maybe once a year they run a query which updates all their prices, say increases them by 3%. Immediately before that would be a good idea to take a backup of the database so that if the query goes wrong you can go back to how things were before you tried to run it. So there are many reasons for running backups. There are many occasions where you might need to run a backup either on a regular scheduled basis or on an ad hoc basis to cover a particular situation. Now there is a very good help topic to explain a lot of this and to tell you how to back up a database and indeed how to restore a database. There's the topic, protect your data with backup and restore processes. I suggest that you read through that topic, note one or two particular topics here, plan regular backups. Backup a split database. This is the situation I briefly mentioned just now where a database is split between data and the user interface side of things. This is what we normally refer to as the back end and the front end. There's the topics on restoring a database or restoring individual objects in a database. So that's a very important topic and it's very important that you get your backup regime in place. Now I'm not going to fully back up this Night Movies database, but I am going to go through part of the backup process as described in this help topic. If I wanted to run a backup now of my Night Movies database, first it's very important to make sure that there is nothing in progress. I'm not halfway through updating a record or something like that. So I'm going to make sure that the database is in effect not being used. This of course becomes a more complicated thing to do when more than one person is using the database. But let's suppose it's just me. I go File, Save As, and one of the options under Save Database As is Backup Database. Now, if I click on Backup Database and then Save As, what Access 2016 will do will be to save my database, and it changes the name. It puts the date as part of the name. And in that way, if you wanted to keep a succession of backups, you could quite easily. And of course that will always identify for you when a particular backup was run. And basically what it does is to take a copy of the ActDB file and its contents at that time. Now for the complete instructions for doing a backup, although to be honest that's almost all of it, I refer you to that help topic, and I do suggest you read through that help topic and treat the contents of it very seriously from this point onwards, particularly if you're creating your own databases already and starting to add valuable data and put valuable time into designing and building tables and other objects. So that's backup in Access 2016. I'll see you in the next section. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we talked about backups, and it's absolutely essential that you get a backup regime in place before your Access databases start having too much of your time and effort invested into them. Something else you need to know about is the fact that over time Access databases can become what we call bloated. I'll come back to bloated in a moment. And also over time, you may get to situations where your databases get broken in some way. Now, I mentioned databases getting broken in the preceding section in relation to needing to restore a database. But sometimes when a database gets broken, it's possible to repair it without having to restore. So in this section, we're going to talk about compact and repair. Now, once again, there's a very good help topic that gives you the background information on compact and repair. And first of all, let's talk about compact. Now, as it says here, database files grow with use. Generally speaking, as you store more and more data, it's not surprising that an ActDB file gets bigger. But when you delete records from tables in an Access database, the space is not automatically reclaimed. It just occupies what is in effect empty space. There are also various pieces of code and data that Access uses when it's working on a database, and over time some of these, which strictly speaking could be deleted, are not deleted. And we get this effect called bloat. And in order to remove the unneeded, unused, wasted space, you compact a database. And compacting not only reduces the size of the database file, but it can improve the speed of performance as well. Now, the other factor here is that database files can become corrupted. There are various ways that corruption can happen. Many of them are associated with an incomplete write to a database. So you only get part of some data written to a database. There are some ways of minimizing the chance of this happening, but it still happens from time to time. And there are certain situations where it happens most often. For instance, if you're using a network database and a network connection is broken, maybe you're connected to a database over a network and your connection is broken. You might also, for instance, have a situation where you're using linked tables that I explained earlier in the course, and the database or computer or server which is holding the tables you're linked to gets rebooted. Somebody doesn't realize that somebody else is linked to those tables, so that computer gets restarted and corruption occurs. Now, if a database file becomes corrupted, sometimes Access will realize that corruption has happened and it will prompt you to repair the database file. Sometimes it doesn't realize that the database is corrupted. Sometimes you'll be able to carry on happily working on a database for a long period of time, doing lots of things to it without realizing that it's actually corrupted. Now, one way of dealing with both the bloat problem and any corruptions is to run a process called compact and repair. Now, you would definitely run this if Access said that it believed that there was a corruption, but you should also run it as part of a general regular maintenance procedure. Now, to run a compact and repair, it's actually pretty straightforward. There is a button on the Database Tools tab in the left-hand Tools group, Compact and Repair Database, and also in Backstage View on the info page there is a Compact and Repair Database option. Now, either of those will do the job, but two very, very important things. First of all, you should normally do a backup before you do a compact and repair, just in case something unusual happens. Compact and repair is usually successful. It will certainly usually compact the data, and if there are problems it will often manage to repair them. But sometimes unexpected things happen, and it's always good to be able to go back to how things were exactly before you tried to do the compact and repair. So a backup is a very good idea. Secondly, you should only do the compact and repair when you have the database open for exclusive use. You don't want to be in a situation where somebody else is working on the database at the same time that you're running compact and repair. Now, you may think, well, I'm running this on my desktop, I'm the only person that's accessing this database, why would anybody else be using it? Well, if you really are the only person that can access this database, then you don't really need to worry about opening it for exclusive use. But if you are in a situation where somebody else may have the database open, opening it for exclusive use becomes very important. Now let me show you how to do that in a straightforward way. Let's close my Night Movies 2 database. So Access is running, but I've got no database open. Now I'm going to go into File. I'm going to click on Open, and I'm going to browse to that database in the usual way, but without using the Recent Databases link. Having found the database, rather than click on Open, if you look at the drop down where Open is, there is an Open Exclusive option. And you'll only be able to open a database for exclusive use if nobody else is currently using it. And once you've opened it for exclusive use, nobody else can open it. Then you do your compact and repair, and then you can close it again if all seems okay, and you can open the database in the normal way. Now, one other very useful option is if you go into Access Options and go to Current Database, there is an option there, Compact on Close. Now, checking that option will mean that Compact and Repair is run every time you close the database, but you should only set that if you really are in a situation where you're the only person that uses that ActDB file. So you don't want to set that if you're in an environment where you're sharing that database with other people. So for more information, I do recommend that you read that Compact and Repair a Database help topic. But that's it for this section. Please join me in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section and the next couple of sections, we're going to look at Datasheet View in quite a bit more detail. Now, I pointed out earlier on that you can do design in Datasheet View and you can do data maintenance in Datasheet View. But I think it's fair to say that it isn't really the most suitable way of doing either of those things. Having said that, many people like to use Datasheet View, and one advantage of using Datasheet View is that you can do both design and data maintenance using one view and one set of tools. So what I'm going to do in this first section is to look at doing design in Datasheet View, and then in the other two sections I'm going to concentrate on the data aspects. We're not going to need the navigation pane for a little while, so let's just collapse that over to the left. And let's select the Fields tab in the Table Tools on the ribbon. Now, if you look at the left-hand group on the Fields tab, you have a Views group with a View button. And of course, I've already pointed out that at the bottom here you've got a choice of Datasheet View or Design View. Now, in fact, you can toggle between those two views just by using the top half of the button. So, bearing in mind that we're looking at design aspects here, let's look at that Add and Delete group. Now, you've already seen that I can add a new field at the end of the field list over there on the right using that Click to Add column. But if I say selected the Country column, the Country field, I could add a field of one of these types just by clicking on the button in the Add and Delete group. So if I wanted a short text field, click there, and I have a short text field with a default name of Field 1 added to the right of the Country column, which is the column that I had selected. Now, some of the most popular data types are shown here with single buttons. So there's number, currency, date and time, yes, no. If I click on More Fields, I have a very, very long list of potential fields that I can add using this approach. The other button that you'll see in the Add and Delete group is the Delete button, and if I want to delete a field, I select it. I get a warning there about permanently deleting the selected field, confirm, and that field is gone again. So that's a straightforward way of adding and deleting fields to a table. Let's move on now to the next group, that's Properties. I mentioned quite a bit earlier on in the course that in Datasheet View you don't really have the full power that you have in design view, but you can certainly do a lot to maintain the properties of the fields in a table. So let's select the trip name column, the trip name field. And some of the controls in the properties group are enabled. So for instance, if I click on name and caption, I could change the name of the field or the description of the field. I could add a caption which would appear in certain situations, as we'll see later on in the course. I can also change the field size for the trip name, or I could set a default value. Currently there isn't a default value for trip name. Notice that the other properties are not enabled. Let me now select the country field. Now the country field, as you know, is enabled as a short text lookup, so the modify lookups control is enabled. Click on modify lookups. I could actually go in here and maintain my value list for this particular lookup field. Let's look now at description. Now description is a long text field. Again, I could change something like the name and caption, but I also get the option of memo settings. Now I haven't talked about memo settings before, but there are two. One of them is append only, and if you set a long text field to be append only, that means that you can only add text to it. You can't change what's there already. This is sometimes used where people want to keep, say, a running log of something that's happened, and all they're going to do is append to the text that's already in this field. The second option there of making it rich text means that it will be formatted as HTML, and therefore you can record formatting within that field as well. So for instance, you could have bold text, or you could change the font in certain places. You could put in italic text and so on. So I'm not going to apply either of those memo settings to our description field. Now let's take a look at the formatting group. And let's start with duration days. Now this is a number field and it's formatted as a general number. But I could change its formatting. For instance, if I wanted to show a $sign, it turns it into a currency field. And as you can see, it's a currency field currently with 2 decimal places. Note the 2 buttons immediately under the word currency at the moment. I can increase or decrease the number of decimal places. So increasing, decreasing, right down to 0 if necessary, and then I could even return it back to being a general number and lose the $sign. And let's assume that I wanted to remove the cents in price minimum. Just select that field. I can remove the cents like that. Of course I could do the same for price maximum as well. Now note the formatting options and how they work will depend primarily on the data type. So in this case we have a data type of currency, and then within that you can choose the appropriate formatting. So if you wanted our local default currency formatting, it's there. If you wanted to format this currency as euros, you could do it like that. But let's go back to our default currency. The last group on the Fields tab is Field Validation. And you have 3 checkboxes there. Is this field required? Must it be unique? Is this field indexed? And of course all of these should have been set correctly by me earlier on in the course. There's also a button there which shows me the validation, if any, on this particular field. And of course the validation that we had on price minimum, the currently selected field, is greater than 0. Now there's a dialog here, Expression Builder, and we're going to be looking at the Expression Builder in quite a bit of detail later on in the course. But you can build up some pretty complex validation rules. In fact, you can build up all sorts of complex things, because you won't only use the Expression Builder for validation, but as I say, more of that later. Apart from looking at the rule, which in this case is a very simple one, greater than 0, you can also maintain the field validation message. So here it's minimum price must be positive. Now, I mentioned earlier on that sometimes you need validation to consider more than one field at a time, and you can actually use the validation control here to set up record validation. So this is validation that includes more than one field in a record. So let's just do, as an example, the validation that I mentioned earlier, and that is that the minimum price can't be more than the maximum price. So again, click on that drop down, but this time not field validation rule, but validation rule. Now, to set up the validation rule, we're going to use some of the items that are in this expression categories section here. And first of all, we're going to use price minimums, so double click that. That is the value in the price minimum field. And to indicate that it's one of the fields in the record, it's in square brackets. And our requirement is that price minimum is less than or equal to price maximum. So that's our validation rule. Now let's put in a validation message. Click on validation message and I'll type a message in. Minimum price cannot be greater than maximum price. Let's try that out with, say, the Louisiana Explorer. Let's change the minimum price from 2880 to 3880 and then click on one of the other records. There we are. Minimum price cannot be greater than maximum price. So what we've done there is to set up a record validation rule. And I think I'm going to leave that record validation rule set up. So I need to put Louisiana Explorer back the way it was. Otherwise I'll have invalid data. Let's turn our attention now to the Table tab on the ribbon. I'm really only going to talk briefly about some of the groups on this tab. There are three middle groups there: before events, after events, named macros. These are all associated with macro code and VBA code that may run or be run as a result of certain events occurring. So for example, if a user makes a booking, you may need various other information in the database updated in response to that booking, such as the availability of a trip, for example, or you may need to trigger an invoice being sent to the customer, either to charge them for their deposit or the balance, or at least to inform them of the details of their booking. As a result of these triggers, you may have various other things happen in your Access database. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we're not really covering programming in any great detail on this course. We will look at macros a little later on. The group on the right, relationships. Relationships are a topic that we are going to cover in some detail on this course, and we're coming back to those in a few sections from now. On the left, the table properties relate to things like sorting and filtering in the table, and we're going to look at those in the next section. So for this section, that's it, and I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section, we're going to look at sorting and filtering in Datasheet view. And in fact, in both this and the next section, it's a good idea, if you are working along with me, to have the Home tab selected, because a lot of the things that we're going to do are accessible via the Home tab, although many of them can be done using just what's available within Datasheet view itself. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is filtering. At the moment we have about a dozen or so trips in our trip table, so it's really not difficult to see all of the trips at once, and if I were trying to select one of these for myself, I could scroll through and decide which one looked most attractive or was within my price range or whatever. Once you've got a very large number of trips to choose from, if I say wanted to find one in my price range or going to a particular country or with a particular level of difficulty, I really wouldn't want to have to go through hundreds, maybe thousands of these to find the ones that match my criterion or criteria. Filtering can help in this way, because if you want to, for example, find all of the trips that are classified as moderate, you can filter to find that. Now there is a sort and filter group on the ribbon, and you can do that using that group, but you can also use the activity level column itself in Datasheet view. If you go to the activity level column and click on the little drop down to the right, it makes available sorts and filters. Now I'm going to look at sorting a little bit later on in this section. Let's concentrate on filters. Now at the moment the first of those filters, select all, is selected. If I deselect it, I now have nothing selected in the activity level column. But if what I wanted to see was the moderate trips, if I click on just moderate and click on OK, all I can see now are the trips that are classified as moderate. Having applied a filter, you get that little filter icon here, like the little filter you used to get in chemistry at school, indicating that a filter has been applied. And if I wanted to clear the filter, I click on that button again. There's an option there, clear filter from activity level, and that effectively puts it back to no filter, which in this case is the same as all activity levels being shown. Now filters can get to become a lot more complex than that. So for instance, if I wanted to filter by country, again click on the little icon there, little drop down icon. I'm going to deselect all here. Well, I want somewhere in the Americas, so that's Costa Rica or the USA. Click on OK, and now I can see the trips that are to anywhere in the Americas, and again I can clear that in the same way. There are then some specialized types of filter. Let's go to the description column now. Now clearly I'm not going to match those long descriptions, but what I get here with a long text field is text filters. And text filters are much more flexible. So for instance, I could say I want to go on a trip where the description includes the word trek. So the description contains trek. So it will look at all those descriptions and find the one with the word trek in it. Now notice what those text filters are. It equals, it does not equal, it begins with something, it doesn't begin with something, contains, doesn't contain, ends with, doesn't end with. So quite a reasonable selection of text filters. Now you also can have numeric types of filter. So if I wanted to filter on the number of days, I could, but let's look at maximum price. So let's suppose that for me the maximum price can't be more than $3,000. So on price maximum filters, I can go for number filters. I'm going to say less than $3,000. It's actually less than or equal to $3,000. And that limits my price range. But I might also say, well, I don't really want to go on a very cheap trip. I've got a budget. I can pay up to $3,000 and I'm prepared to pay, say, over $2,000. Let's go back in. I don't have to clear the existing filter. I can just go in and set a different one. So I could say between, say, $2,000 and $3,000. And they're the trips whose maximum price is in that range. Now that should be enough information to get you started on filters, but let me just point out a couple of the more advanced features which you may want to turn your attention to later on. When you have a filter applied such as this one, you can toggle the filter on and off, and there's a toggle filter button in the sort and filter group on the home tab on the ribbon. If I click toggle filter now, I'm back to seeing all of the records. Click it again and the latest filter is applied. And also advanced, there's an option there to clear all filters, but also there is a filter by form option, and with this option you can set filters on more than one field at a time. So you can go into a particular field and set a filter, set a filter on a different field and come up with a more complex filter on the records in the table. When you've got this option in force, you can then close, and there is an even more advanced option, which is Advanced Filter Sort, which lets you set up really a quite complex system of filtering and sorting records. Now that's outside the scope of what we're going to do here, but in the future you may want to look into those possibilities. Let's now take a look at sorting. Now I mentioned just now the Advanced Filter Sort, and once you get used to some of the facilities within Access 2016, you may indeed do some very complex filtering and sorting. But for the moment, I'm just going to point out basic sorting. And first of all, let me point out that for a straightforward table like this one, where you have a primary key which is an auto number ID, and as you add records to the table they get successively larger IDs, the table is by default sorted by ID. If I wanted to sort by, for example, country, all I need to do is to say select country, click on the drop down. There is a sort ascending, that's A to Z, or a sort descending, sort Z to A. So ascending, it's now sorted by alphabetical sequence of country. Click again, let's have descending. That's sorted on descending alphabetical sequence of country name. And of course you can also have sorts on numeric fields. So if I wanted to sort the trips in this table according to ascending order of maximum price, click on the drop down, sort smallest to largest, and there we are. I've now switched into the Night Movies database just to point out one other thing here. I'm going to show you what is a little bit of a problem. It does have a number of alternative solutions. Let's suppose you wanted to sort the movies in the movie database based on title. Let's select the title column and then sort them into sequence, ascending sequence A to Z. What you would find is that two of the movies, 12 Angry Men and 12 Years a Slave, appear at the top of the list because when Access does alphabetical sorting, it treats numeric characters before alphas. So 12 Angry Men and 12 Years a Slave appear first. They don't appear as though their titles were the words 12 and then Angry Men and the word 12 and then Years a Slave. Now one way around this, and probably the most popular way around this, is that when people set up tables like this in a database, they have another column, another field, which is called the sort title, the title to sort with. Now usually the sort title is the same as the actual title, so for A Beautiful Mind, the sort title would be A Beautiful Mind. But for 12 Angry Men, the sort title would be 12 Angry Men, but instead of 1, 2, it would be the word 12. And then when somebody's sorting the list of movies, it's sorted as though 1, 2 was the word 12. The same approach is used to overcome another very common problem, and that's the ones that all begin with the. Now some people would want to see The Aviator after Terminator 2. Some people would prefer to see Aviator at the beginning in with the A's. So sorting can be a little bit of a problematic thing, and you will need to adopt whatever approach you think is most suitable in a given situation. That's sorting and filtering. We've got one more section on Datasheet View where we're going to look at data entry and modification. That's the next section. I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this third section on Datasheet View, I'm going to look at actually entering and modifying data in Datasheet View. We've done a little bit of this already, but I want to give you some useful tips and information about finding your way around when you need to add or modify data, and also how to make this process easier, particularly in specific situations. So I'm going to close the navigation pane. I don't need that at the moment. And what we're going to look at first is the column widths. Now you've already seen how to adjust a column width. So for instance, if I wanted to increase or decrease the width of the country column, I hover over the header, go to the right hand edge till I get the double arrow, and then I can manually adjust the width. However, if I right click on the heading, one of the options is field width, and then I can either specify a column width in units. So for instance, I could say here I don't want 19.25, I want 16. Click on OK. Or there's also a best fit option. Let me select a couple of columns. Let me select trip name, hold the shift key down and select activity level. Right click, field width, click on best fit. Now both of those columns widths have been adjusted to fit all of the data. Now when you're dealing with a long text field like the description field, Access 2016 won't necessarily make the width of a column absolutely huge until it gets all of the text in, because that could make it a very wide field indeed. But if I right click on that and go to field width and do best fit, it does make it quite a bit wider, but it's limited and it only goes so far in that width. Now note there that once I'd made the description field in particular much wider, I now need that scroll bar at the bottom to go from left to right through the fields in my table in Datasheet view. Now not only can you adjust the column widths, you can adjust the row height as well. And again, you've got two basic options there. If you select a row and then go to the lower edge over here on the left, note again the double arrow, I can drag row height and it adjusts the height of all rows. Note in this case that with a long text field like description, this has the advantage that you're sort of moving all of the text or a lot more of the text into view. Now note that you can also set this to a fixed height using a little dialog. So if I right click say on ID 4, go to row height, if I wanted to say make it a specific height, say 50 units, click on OK. All of the rows, all of the records in the table, the rows in Datasheet view adopt that same height. That can be a particularly useful thing for two reasons. One, as I've just pointed out, where you've got a long text field, it can help you to see more of the long text at once. And a second very useful reason is that if you're using touch, it can make it a lot easier to be very accurate with touch with those taller rows, because if you switch between touch and mouse mode, let me just demonstrate this, although it spaces out the controls on the ribbon for example, it doesn't make any difference to the spacing and arrangement of the data in Datasheet view. So let's just go into touch mode now, look at the ribbon and look at the data. Although the ribbon is spaced out more, the data isn't. So I'm going to put that row height back somewhere near where it was before. And a couple of other things that can be useful when you're working on data. If you have a table with many fields, so you've got many columns in Datasheet view, there may be a situation where the work you're going to do on maintaining data only needs you to see a small number of columns. And if say you wanted to update the activity levels and the maximum prices and they were spread out, separated by a huge amount of space, there are a couple of ways you can make life a little bit easier for yourself. One of them is that you can put the two columns together. So let me take the price maximum column. I've selected the column, and if I click on the header, I can drag it over to be right next to the activity level. And that makes it easy for me to work on those two columns together. Now that doesn't change the design. If I go into design view now, it doesn't change the sequence of those fields in the design, but it does change them in Datasheet view. And being able to move columns into new positions like that can make it much easier to work on data. Another thing that you can do is to at least temporarily hide a column. So if for instance the description column was getting in the way while you're doing some updates, if you right click on it, one of the options is hide fields. You could select more than one column of course and do hide fields, and that column is now temporarily hidden. If I subsequently want to unhide it, if I go to duration day and right click, unhide fields, it shows me a little dialog, and I can see that any of the unchecked fields are hidden. So if I want to show description again, I just check it there. Obviously if I wanted to hide something, I could uncheck it there. So in that way you can hide and unhide fields, again, to make it easier to work on your data. Let's now look at some of the mechanics of entering and updating data. First thing I'm going to show you how to do is to delete a record. Now, the Louisiana Explorer we've used a few times already on the course for demonstration and testing purposes. It's not a real trip, so let's delete it. If I select it and then right click, one of the options is delete record. But note also that on the Home tab on the ribbon, in the Records group, there is a delete button, and you can use that. Delete record. You're asked for a confirmation, click yes, and the Louisiana Explorer has gone. Now note that deleting a record is something that you cannot undo. So when you've deleted a record, that's it, it's gone. Now notice at the moment that I have selected the ID field in the first record in the trip table. If I press the tab key, not only do I go through the fields in that record, but as I enter each field, the whole of the contents of the field are highlighted. And if I start typing now, I'll immediately delete everything that's in that field. It may be that you want to overwrite everything that's in the field, but it may not be. So you need to be aware of the fact that as you tab through the fields in a record, the whole of each field will be selected as you enter it in Datasheet View. Now, if I've done this by accident and I type that X and I say to myself, oh no, I've overtyped what it said in trip name, all you need to do is press the escape key and you'll be back to where you were. And then if you want to actually make a specific correction, what you really need to do is to click within the field with the mouse or touch with your finger, get to the point that you want to get to, and then just start deleting and typing text as normal. So just be careful. Let me press tab again. You notice how each time I have the whole field selected. So one of the other useful things to be able to do is to find your way around the records in a table, and in the bottom left hand corner there we have navigation buttons. These are pretty standard types of navigation buttons. Note that I currently have the first record in the table selected, and the counter at the bottom says 1 of 12. So this is record 1 of 12 records in the table. There is a right single arrow there which will take me through the records in the table. I'm keeping this all full screen so that you can see me stepping through the records. Obviously I can go backwards. I can use the first one there, a sort of go back to the start if you're using a DVD player or an old VCR or something like that. That takes me back to record 1. That takes me to the last record in the table. And there's another little button there which will take me to the place where I've started creating a new record. And just a couple of other quick points here. Wherever you are in a table in Datasheet View, if you do want to enter a new record, you don't have to use the navigation buttons down there to take you to the end or scroll down. The Records group on the Home tab includes a new. That achieves the same thing. And when you're entering a new record, you get to the point that you've entered all of the field values that you need to. In order to save the new record, so far we've been clicking elsewhere, normally on another record, in order to try to save the record that we've just been entering. There is also in the Records group a Save button. So when you finish typing the values in the fields, click on Save and it will save the record, subject of course to what you've entered being valid. Something else that can be very useful in Datasheet View is the ability to find particular data and possibly even to replace particular data. Let me demonstrate this with an example. Let's suppose that I know that generally speaking in descriptions when I use numbers, such as for instance here, view the big 6, Or in some of these descriptions, when I talk about the number of days or nights, it's got 8 nights and 3-star hotels and so on. I know that in one or two situations I put a word instead of a number, and I just want to be consistent about this. And somebody said to me, oh, I saw one of your descriptions there, it's got the word 7 in it, S-E-V-E-N, and it should be the number 7. Now, if I've got hundreds of trips, I think, oh goodness, am I going to go through and try and find that? Now, one way of dealing with this kind of thing, whatever kind of content it is, whatever field it is in and so on, is to use the controls in the Find group on the Home tab. So let's take this specific case as an example. Let's suppose that I know the word 7 is in use there somewhere and I want to replace it with a numeric digit 7. If I click on Replace, it brings up the Find and Replace dialog. And what I can say is, well, what I'm looking for, find what? I'm looking for the word 7, and I want to replace it with a 7. Now, look in the current field. Well, the current field is, well, I've got the ID column selected. Let's say just the current document, so anywhere. Match the whole field. No, it's not the whole field, it's just a word in a field, so any part of a field. Search all. Do I need to match case? No. Let's see if I can find a 7 somewhere. Oh, look, it's found one there. In the first record, ID 4, Wild for 7 nights, it said. Well, it should be a 7. So let's do a replace. Now, has it found another one? No, there isn't another one. That's the only case. So, of course, if I knew this was in a specific field, so for instance, if I wanted to change the way a particular country's name is spelt or described or something, then I can use Find and Replace in Datasheet View. That is it for now on Datasheet View. It's time to start looking at relationships and getting 1 or 2 more tables into our database. We'll start that in the next section. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In this section we're going to start to look at relationships. Something that I haven't mentioned before is that Access is a relational database management system. And with Access you create relational databases. What we mean by a relational database is that at the basis, at the core of the system, is a set of tables and the relationships between the entities in those tables. Now, in order to demonstrate what we mean by this, I'm going to create a relationship between 2 tables. And since we only have 1 table so far in the Esprit de Tour database, that's the trip table, I need to create a second table. And that's what I'm going to do first in this section. Now, very early on in the course, I talked about a trip type. And I pointed out at the beginning that I wasn't going to store trip type in the trip table. What I'm going to do now is to create a new table, and that table will hold a list of the types of trip that Esprit de Tour offer. So first of all we go to Create. Now on this occasion I'm going to click on Table Design, and that gives me an empty table without even an ID field in it, because on this occasion, and this is a little bit controversial, not everybody will agree with this, but on this occasion I'm not going to have an ID auto-numbered type field. I'm only at this stage going to have a single field in this table, and it's going to be type, and its data type will be short text. Now, given that it is the only field in the table, I need to make it the primary key of the table. So the type itself will uniquely identify a record in this table. So I select this field, then I can make it the primary key by clicking the Primary Key button in the Tools group on the Design tab. That is now the primary key of this table. Now let's check some of the other properties. Field size. Trip types won't generally be very long, so I'm going to set a maximum size of 30. I'm going to say that definitely a type is required. It's the only field, so without that there is no record. Do I allow 0 length? No, I don't. And is it indexed? Yes, but no duplicates. As it is the primary key, we couldn't have a duplicate value here. So basically, that is the single field in my new table. Now let me save that table. I'm going to call it table type. So let me open up my type table. Of course, it's completely empty at the moment, but I know how to enter data, and the first record that I'm going to enter is activity. So that is one of my types. Now, by the way, I mentioned in a preceding section how you can always save these records by just clicking on the next one. There are various ways that you can move on to the next record to enter the data. If I press the down arrow key now, it takes me to the next record. Of course, it validates the one that I've entered to make sure that it's a valid set of fields, in this case a single field. So the next one is... So I'll just type in the rest of these. Join me again at the end of me doing that. Now, having done a set of typing like this, don't forget there is a spell checker in the records group. It will only apply to the current data set in this case, but if I click on spelling, I'm hoping it will tell me if I've misspelt anything. No, it seems to be happy with all of that. So they're the values for my types. Obviously at a later stage I may introduce other types of tour, but that'll certainly get me started. Let me close the type table. Now what I'm going to do is to go to the Database Tools tab, and I'm going to open the Relationships window. Now this window shows the relationships that exist between the tables in my database. At the moment I have no relationships, but I do have this Show Table dialog. And what this Show Table dialog does is to enable me to control which tables are shown in the Relationships window. Now I need to show both the trip table and the type table. And what I now need to do is to create a relationship between them. And the relationship between them will define the fact that a trip can be of many types. Now, in order to do this, we normally introduce a third table, and this third table in this case will be what many people call a link table, linking trips to types. And I'm going to create that link table next. So I'm going to close the Show Table dialog for the moment, and I'm going to click on Create, and this time I'm going to say Create Table, and I get that ID field. I'm going to need an ID in this case, but let me go into Design View. This table is going to be called Table, and it's going to be Trip Type. And this is the table that is going to enable me to link each trip to the type of trip that it is. So let's click on OK. And what I need to do in this table is to specify, apart from the unique ID, two things. I need to specify a trip, and I need to specify a type. Now by default each of these fields is a short text field, but that is not always the case that these actually turn out to be short text fields, as you'll see in a moment. Now the trip field needs to be able to uniquely identify which trip I'm talking about, which trip is being linked to by a record in this table. And as you know, with a trip, the unique identifier, let's go into the trip table design view. Notice how I've now got three different things open, but this is the trip table. The unique identifier, the primary key in the trip table, is the ID, and that is an auto number field. And in order for the trip type table to uniquely identify a trip, it needs to store the primary key value for the trip it refers to. Now, as you will discover, and you will use many times, when we are referring to an auto number field, the type we want here is not short text. It's actually a numeric field, and it's actually a long integer. And in order to make it clear what I'm referring to here, I'm going to change the name of this field to trip ID, just to emphasize the fact that this field refers to a trip ID, which is the primary key of a trip record. So, now when a field in a record points to a primary key in another record, in this record this is what's called a foreign key. So within the table trip type, trip ID is a foreign key, and it points to the primary key in a trip record. Now let's turn our attention to type. Now in this case, if you remember, let me just open up the type table again in Design View. Now in the type table, the primary key is actually a short text field. It's the trip type. And there's absolutely no reason that I shouldn't use that as the primary key here. And therefore in the trip type record, in the trip type table, when I refer to the type, I'm referring to a short text field. So this needs to be short text as well. And this is, but it's a unique identifier in the form of a piece of short text, and in fact it is the primary key of the type. Now one of the reasons that I created the type records in the way that I did this time is to show that although you will very often refer to auto-numbered ID fields and the foreign keys will be of type long integer, you will sometimes use short text fields as well. In fact, there are one or two other possibilities, but those two cover most situations, either long integer or short text. Now I've just got to check the properties for each of these now. So I'm looking at the table trip type. The type field, it says maximum 255. Well, of course it only needs to agree with the maximum for type, which is 30. Is it required? Yes, it is. Do we allow 0? No, we don't. Is it indexed? Yes, it is. And it's a case that duplicates are okay, because the same type may be used by many trips. Now let's just check trip ID. This is a long integer, of course, because it's referring to an auto number field elsewhere. Is it required? Yes, it is. And is it indexed? Well, yes, it needs to be indexed as well. And again, duplicates will be okay, because the same trip may occur in many trip type records. So we'll save that, and we'll close that, and we'll close that, and we're back to our relationships table. If I right click in the relationships window, one of the options is show table. That brings up that dialog again, and I'm now going to add the trip type table to the relationships window. Close the show table dialog again. I can drag these table rectangles around, and on this occasion it's very helpful to see what's going on if I put the trip type table between the other two. What I now need to do is to set up the relationships between the tables in my Esprit de Tour database, and that's the point at which we're going to start the next section. Please join me for that. Welcome back to our course on Access 2016. In the preceding section we started looking at relationships, and in order to set up relationships for the Esprit de Tour database, I created a new table containing the types of trip that Esprit de Tour run, and a link record, a record that's going to link each trip with the types that that trip has. And in that way we are building up indirectly a relationship between trip and type using the link record, and in fact the relations we set up are from trip to trip type and from type to trip type. So in order to do this we actually set up two relationships. The first relationship we're going to set up is trip to trip type, and the relationship is based on the ID in the trip table. So each record in the trip table, each trip has a unique ID, that's the primary key, and records in the trip type table for that trip will have that same trip ID in the trip ID field in the records in the trip type table. Now in order to set up the relationship, what I do is to drag ID in the trip table and drop it onto trip ID in the trip type table. And that brings up the edit relationships dialog, where I can actually set up the details of the relationship between these two tables. Now the first thing I do is to make sure that I've got the right tables and the right fields. So on the left, table query trip ID, yep, that's the primary ID of the trip table records, that's fine. And then trip type, trip ID, that is the long integer field that I've set up to match the ID in the trip table. So I've definitely got the right tables and fields selected. The next important decision is, do I enforce referential integrity? Now on this occasion I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to explain to you now what referential integrity is. Let's imagine a situation where I've created a trip, and corresponding to that trip I've say created 4 trip type records. So there's a trip type of beach, and a trip type of family, and a trip type of adventure, and a trip type of escorted, and each of those has the appropriate type, beach, etc., and the trip ID for my selected trip. What would happen if I deleted that trip from the trip table? I'd finish up with 4 records in the trip type table that had no links at the other end of this relationship. They'd be sort of orphans. So those 4 records would be referring to a trip that no longer exists. Making sure that that doesn't happen is called enforcing referential integrity. And once I've checked that, if I try to delete a trip, what Access 2016 will do is it will make sure that there are no outstanding trip type records that use that trip. So it won't let me break the database integrity in the way that I just described. Now there are a couple of other options. Let me talk about one of them. A couple of options down below enforce referential integrity. Cascade delete related records. If I check this option, if I deleted a trip record in the situation I just described, Access would automatically cascade delete the trip type records for that trip. Now that of course would mean that the database wasn't broken, because those 4 records would automatically get deleted. So I could enforce referential integrity by checking that box, and that would make sure that nothing got broken by a delete. But for the moment I'm actually going to uncheck this box, but I am going to say enforce referential integrity. The next piece of information here is the relationship type one-to-many, and what that means in this situation is that one trip can have many trip types, and that's exactly the situation that I want. So let me create that relationship, and there it is, one trip, many trip types. Now let's set up the second relationship. It's from the type in the type table. Note that although this is a short text field, it is the primary key of the type table, and it goes to type in the trip type table. And that sets up a different relationship. Now we have the same questions. So again, I just check I've got the right fields. So the primary key in the type table is type. The field in the trip type table that I'm setting the relationship up with is type, so that will be a foreign key in the trip type table. I'm once again going to enforce referential integrity, because if I were to delete a type in the type table, I would want to make sure that there weren't any entries in the trip type table that was still using that type. Now once again, I'm not going to check cascade delete here. I'm going to leave that unchecked. A consequence of this is that if I did try to delete a type that was in use, Access wouldn't let me do it. I'd have to get rid of all the entries in the trip type table that use that type first before I could delete the type itself. So that's the alternative to cascade delete. Now once again, it's a one-to-many relationship, because one entry in the type table, one type, can have many corresponding records in the trip type table. So I click on create, and I have another one-to-many relationship. The infinity symbol at the end there indicates many. So what we've done here in creating these two relationships is to put in place probably one of the most fundamental building blocks in a relational database. And although in many ways when you first look at relationships, if you've not seen this before, it may all seem rather baffling, when you do understand this, and hopefully you do already, it really is one of the most fundamental aspects of any relational database, certainly a fundamental aspect of Access, which once you've got to grips with it, once you understand what's going on, it really makes an awful lot of other things in relational databases and Access much easier to understand. You will also see why we don't use things like multi-value fields, because multi-value fields can cause all sorts of problems. Now conceptually at first what we've done here does take a little bit of getting used to, but once you are used to it, you'll find it makes many other things not only much easier but much more flexible as well. Now one very big downside of what we've done so far is that visualizing now the trip database in the light of what we've just done can be a little bit tricky. And in many ways what we really need now is a couple of nice forms to show us how all of this hangs together. You've got a couple of sections to wait before we get to that point though. And the next thing I'm going to do in this section is to actually set some data up to reflect what I've just done. And then in the next section I'm going to set you an exercise to set up an equivalent set of relationships within the movie rental database. So let me first of all close the relationships window, making sure that I save the changes. And then let me just refresh my memory on the trip table. Open it up. There are my trips. The IDs go from 4 to 15. Then let me open up my type table, the one I created just recently. And now let me open up my trip type table. My trip type table is currently empty. Now, I hope you can cast your mind back to quite a while ago now. I showed you this first example of a trip, the GCA trip that's currently in our trip table. And I mentioned there the type, and there are 5 values of type for this trip: family, escorted, group, activity, landscapes. And I said we'd skip that at that time, which we did. Well, now's the time that we're coming back, and we're going to set those up. Now, back to my trip table. Note that I can switch between these open documents. They're all 3 tables, but all I need to do is to click on the tab. And the GCA trip has an ID of 4. So all I need to do is go to trip type, type in an ID of 4 and a type of, well, one of them is family. That should be okay. Press the down arrow. Yep, we're fine. Now this is another one for 4. This one is, that's fine as well. Let's make a mistake. Let's say I'm going to try to set up for trip ID 3. and that's going to be group. You cannot add a change of record because a related record is required in the table trip. So it knows that there is no trip 3. Of course there used to be, but there isn't any longer. So that should be 4. And similarly, if I say misspelt the type, it would tell me there was an error there as well. Okay, let me just put in the rest of those. Now at this point you're probably looking at that and thinking, my goodness, that is a really slow way of setting all of this up. And I think anybody who doesn't think that's a slow way of setting things up must be much more patient than I am, because of course in the longer term we're certainly not going to be setting up this information like that. The reason that I'm doing it like this here is just to emphasize exactly what happens with these relationships and these link records. Note the ID of the trip type records, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We will rarely, if ever, use those, but they're there to uniquely identify trip type records, and it may be that at some point later on we may need those IDs. What's important is the trip ID, so these trip type records are all for trip 4, and there are 5 of them, so we know that trip 4 has 5 types associated with it. So let's see referential integrity at work, shall we? Let's go to our trip table. Let's go to trip 4. Right click, delete record. Dangerous this. The record cannot be deleted or changed because the table trip type includes related records. So I cannot delete that until I get rid of the trip type records. If I had enabled cascade delete, it would let me do it, but I haven't, so it won't. Now, as I said just now, I realise that this is a pretty manual way of doing a job like this, and you're maybe thinking of databases with thousands of records on them and thinking, my goodness, am I going to sit down and type all that in? And the answer, of course, is no, and you almost certainly wouldn't expect your users to. So we do need to start to use forms to make all this a lot easier, quicker and safer. But the first thing we're going to do in the next section is you are going to do an exercise similar to what's been covered in this section and the preceding one, but you're going to set up some relationships in the movie rental database. That's what we're covering next. I'll see you then. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2016. It's almost time for you to do exercise 3. But before you do, I want to just quickly run through another example of setting up relationships in the Esprit de Tour database, and this is going to give you some very helpful tips on how to set up a more efficient set of relationships and a more efficient way of entering data in the movie rental database. Now what I'm going to do is going to be pretty much the same as I did setting up these types, but I'm going to set up countries instead in Esprit de Tour. So I've created a country table. It just has a single short text field, country, and I've set up the countries which are visited in one or more of our tours. Now what I'm going to do is to create the link table, which in this case is going to be the trip country table. So I've set up those fields within that link table record, and I've set the basic properties for each of the fields. But now I'm going to go one step farther, and instead of just saying that the country in a trip country record must be one of the countries in the country table, I'm actually going to use the country table to give me a drop-down list of available countries. So with the country field selected in the trip country design, I'm going to click back in short text there again, and I'm going to say Lookup Wizard. And then what I'm going to say is I want the lookup field to get the values from another table or query. And click on next. The table I'm going to get these values from is the country table. That's fine. Which field am I going to use? That one, the country field. It's the only one there is. What I can also do is to say how I would like the entries in the drop down that I see sorted. I'm clearly just going to sort them on that one field. So in this case, I'm just going to sort them into ascending order of country. Now it shows me what would currently be in my list, so that's the countries that I've set up. I can now set the width for this list, make it a little bit narrower there, click on next. And I can actually, even at this point, establish the relationship automatically, including enabling data integrity. And notice the option there that's selected. I can either say restrict delete, which is what we've done in the case of trip type, or I can specify cascade delete. But in this case, I'm going to go for the restrict delete option. And then I click on finish. The table must be saved before relationships can be created. Save now, yes. Now let's take a look at the relationships window again. And by the way, if when you select this you don't see the newly created relationship, if you go to the Design tab here in the Relationship Tools and click on All Relationships, that will show you all relationships. It sometimes doesn't update when you create a relationship in the way that we just have. But as you see here, we have a one-to-many relationship from country to trip country. And of course, if I double click on that to look at the details, it's enforce referential integrity without cascade delete. So that's one half of the job done. Let's now do the same from trip to trip country, but this one is a little bit trickier, as you will see. So I go back to trip country, I click in trip ID, and again I go for Lookup Wizard. And again, I want to look up the field to get the values from another table or query. So click on next. The table that contains the values that I want to select from is the trip table. Click on next. And if I followed the pattern of the previous couple of cases, I'd copy one of the available fields over. The field that is going to be the basis of the relationship is the ID field, the ID of the trip matching the trip ID in the trip country record. So I'll definitely need that, but just showing the IDs will be problematic because I'll just be choosing from numbers. I may well not be able to remember what each number is in terms of a trip name or a trip code. So what I'm going to do is to display the code and the trip name as well. Now I'm still only going to store the ID in the trip country record as the basis for the relationship, but displaying the code and the trip name will make it easier for people to identify the trip. So with all those three fields to display, click on next. How would I like the list sorted? Well, I can sort it on any of the fields that are being displayed. I think I'll sort it on code, trip code. Now note that I have the option for sorting on up to 4 fields, but I only need to sort on code on this occasion. Click on next. Now, hide key column. Well, you could hide the key column. On this occasion, I want to display the key column. This is the ID that's going to be stored in the trip country record, but I certainly don't need the column as wide as that. The code column only needs to be wide enough to display 3 characters, and let's use quite a bit of space for the other one to make sure that all my trip names can get in. That looks fine. Click on next. Now when you select a row in the lookup field, you can store a value for that row in your database. Which of those 3 is going to be the value I store? Well, of course it's the ID that I store. So click on next. Do I want to enable data integrity? I do. Do I want to cascade delete or restrict delete? I'm going to restrict delete. Click on finish. The table must be saved before relationships can be created. Save now, yes. And now with a bit of luck, my relationship will be created. Let's go to the relationships window. Let's go to the Design tab for Relationship Tools. Show all relationships. Just open that up and make sure it looks okay. It does. Okay, let's go to the trip country table. Let's open it in Datasheet view. The first thing we need to do is to choose a trip. Now, if I click on the drop down now, look what I get. I get a list of IDs, list of codes, a list of trip names. That makes it much easier for me to choose the trip that I'm going to store this information for. Now, in the original list, sorted in ID sequence, the first trip was Grand Canyon Family Rafting Adventure. Note that when I select that, I get the number 4 stored in the trip ID field. So it's the ID that's stored. The other 2 fields are only there for information. And then the country is USA. Let's click down and do another one. Iconic Italy, for example. Trip ID 5. Country visited, Italy. And so on. So as you can see, by using more than one field, I make it possible to do a link between numeric fields, but with text to help me make my choices. So that finally brings us to exercise 3. I provided you with a list in the exercises folder of information about the 50 movies. It's called movierentalmovieinfo.txt. And although it's not in a format that is readily suitable for you to import the data into Access, it does list the genre for each of the 50 movies. So, for instance, The Shawshank Redemption, genre crime drama. The Godfather, genre crime drama. And then for Schindler's List, it's drama biopic history. What I'd like you to do is to set up a genre table and then a link from movie to genre. I'd then like you to set up some data. Just data for 2 or 3 movies is fine. If you're feeling very patient and you're enjoying yourself, you may want to set them all up, of course, but then I may give you a few tips on doing that later on. But I would like your setup to work using the features that I've shown you earlier on in this section. So if you look at my answer to this exercise, exercise 3, if you open up the movie genre table, I have actually entered all of the movie and genre in there. But if you click, say, in this row in the movie genre table, you can see that it's the IDs and the movie titles, and the movies are sorted into alphabetical sequence of title. And when I'm selecting a genre to create one of these records, then there's the list of genre, again in alphabetical sequence. So I'd like you to do the equivalent of that for exercise 3. I'll see you in the next section.
To download the Microsoft Access practice exercise files and follow along, click the link right over there. To see the rest of the videos in this series, click right over there. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up, some comments, and don't forget to subscribe.